Hi, welcome back to TP201 Transfer Pricing for Intangibles. This is another video in our series about the resale price method. Now, we already presented one example of using a resale price method when you're using internal data. And one of the things we want to talk about here is when can the resale price method be maybe the preferred method than looking at the comparable profits method. I mean, there'll be times when a resale price method may resolve some of the problems where the comparable profits method isn't particularly sensitive to the transfer price because it's much more influenced by other transactions that are not the related party transaction. But there'll be times when the RPM won't solve the problem, and we can think of other different alternatives that we might take. But let's just walk through some examples to get some ideas here. So let's start off with this transaction. It's an internal, we can think of this as a distributor. And this is the P&L before we've done any kind of separation. But we can see that the tested party here, or the distributor in this case, can identify the COGS that they're paying to the parent versus the COGS that they pay to the third party. And probably the important thing to note here is just how large the third party transactions are relative to the related parties. So I'm just going to quickly sort of circle that. So in essence, we have $17 of third-party transactions for every dollar we have of the unrelated party transactions. So just wanted to make sure everybody could sort of notice that, because that's going to be key to our issue here. Now, we have we have an operating profit of $490 relative to the $20,000 here. That would produce a operating margin of about 2.45. Now, the value here is to look at this first as if we could do an internal RPM. If the parent could say, well, we know where these revenues are from parent products versus the third party, and if we separate those out, we came up with just some round numbers. Here it is, we sold most of what we sell is these uncontrolled party transaction. That's 18,880. So that worked out to a gross margin of 10%. Look at the gross margin we make on the related party transactions, 9.8%, which they're very close. If we were able to maybe segment the uncontrolled transactions to various different third parties that we might be buying from, there might be a whole range around 10. And that 9.8 is very close to the 10. There's no real indication here that there's a problem in the pricing of the related party transactions. So let's move on from this case and then ask what would happen. I'm going to go to the next slide. If our financial results aren't really clearly dependent upon the related party transactions. This is going to be a problem when, in this particular case, because the related party transactions are a very small part of the total COGS. If we're ever looking at the total P&L, we'll have a hard time determining a movement in the operating margin as it's related to the related party transactions because they're just a very small portion. So we're back to our example here where you can see the numbers. Again, I'm pointing out how small the COGS are from the parent. Now, in this example, look what we've done here. The only number we've changed in that P&L is to lower the revenue. And let's suppose that revenue dropped because the distributor needed to discount the product so that they could sell. They're selling the same amounts of what they're selling, but not being able to sell it for as much. And in fact, they've incurred an operating loss. Right? So their operating profit, in parentheses, is the loss. Well, the implications of this, if one were just looking at the operating profit and a comparable profits method, you could see the danger here. Let me bring back up my pen. In this case, if you took the margin, let's suppose in the first case that we had, right, and that was 2.45% operating margin. I'm going to label that down here so you know I'm not talking about the gross margin. And if you multiply that times the total sales of the 18,000, well, in that case, you're going to expect the profit to equal I think I worked out the number, it's at 441. Well, 441. If an IRS agent showed up and said, you've got related party transactions and you should have made a profit of 441. And you say, well, I had a loss of 1,510. To make an adjustment that would actually get me in the range, I'd have to make an adjustment somewhere in my expenses. And the only one we're talking about here is the related party expense. But those two numbers together would be an adjustment of, you need 1,951. Let me say, this is my little attempt at a comma. I should probably get rid of that. I think it's probably more confusing. 1,951. That's actually more than what my parent charged me. The parent not only would have to give me the goods for free, they'd have to pay me to take them off their hands. So you can see the problem you can run into trying to apply a comparable profits method, looking at something like the operating margin, and especially when your transactions are only a small part from related parties, and you have a lot of transactions, especially purchases from unrelated parties in this case. So if that's the case, using an RPM may solve this problem. In this case, let's suppose we do the same kind of separation of the goods that were sold, and we can see then that we calculate the new gross margins. Now, in both cases, you can see here that, we have negative gross profit, and therefore we have negative gross margins. Actually, the one rounds to zero because it's so small, but it's a negative number. We had done this same type of an example for the cup, where we can say you can't adjust the COGS enough to make the CPM for the total P&L get into the range. But here, if you had the data from uncontrolled parties, you could easily show that your gross profits are negative for both situations. The fact that you're losing so much money really has nothing to do with the transfer price. It has everything to do with the decline in the market that lowered your revenues. And that's the key issue that we want to say, is that with an RPM, we can see that it's not the transfer pricing causing the problem, because the related party and the uncontrolled transactions are turning a profit or turning a loss at the same level. Thanks. I hope that clarified the value of using an RPM when you've got essentially very small controlled transactions relative to your total P&L. Another solution you might consider would be to, at a minimum, just segment out the controlled transactions as its own P&L, so that you aren't letting the uncontrolled transactions have a very large influence on the amount of adjustment that might be calculated, because it really will make it hard to identify the impact of a related party transaction on the total P&L. Thanks. I hope you enjoyed this video. Please give us a like or comments, and have a great day.